There are stories you were never meant to hear, stories sealed behind iron gates, buried in ledgers that refuse to speak, whispered only in the silence of abandoned hallways. Tonight, I will open one of those vaults for you. But understand this, once you hear it, you cannot return to who you were. The walls of the world will feel thinner. The institutions you trusted will look different, and a voice inside you will never stop asking what else they've hidden. This is the story of two brothers, flesh and blood, torn apart not by war, not by disease, but by the very system their parents believed would protect them. The Fialkowski family thought they had found safety in America, but safety is a mask, and behind that mask are hands that take more than they ever give back. Hands that sign your name into a ledger and erase your existence in the same stroke. Penhurst State School and Hospital was no sanctuary. It was a fortress of silence, a sprawling red-brick empire of human misery where children were not raised but processed, not healed but harvested. Behind its gates, innocence was currency, spent, discarded, and replaced by numbers on a chart. The brothers entered Penhurst on a cold March morning in 1963. Their journey there was a funeral march disguised as a drive. In the back of their father's aging Plymouth, they sat pressed together, clutching each other's hands as if bone and blood could defy what was waiting beyond the gates. They whispered in Polish, fragments of promises, fragments of courage. They had already survived one nightmare, the ruins of Warsaw, the hunger of war, the long crossing of an ocean, but nothing could prepare them for this one. When the asylum rose into view, it did not look like healing. It looked like judgment, a red fortress with windows barred like prison cells, a name on a cracked sign that felt less like welcome, more like sentences. Their mother's rosary beads dug into her palm, but even her whispered prayers couldn't stop what was coming. Do you understand the cruelty of institutional power? It doesn't strike like lightning. It doesn't even shout. It organizes. It writes reports. It speaks calmly with authority. And in that calm, entire families are dismantled. Social workers told the parents this was temporary, that the children needed professional care, that the state could give what immigrant hands could not. They dressed the theft of blood in the language of benevolence. That's how the system always works. It smiles as it cuts. The first cruelty was separation. A nurse in a white uniform pried the brothers' hands apart. One was pulled left, the other right. Their last sight of each other was through a pane of reinforced glass. Small palms pressed desperately against the surface, eyes wide and uncomprehending. The doors slammed shut. Childhood ended with the sound of locks. Inside, the machinery of erasure began immediately. They were stripped of names and reduced to numbers. Patient 4847. Patient 4848. Numbers are the language of control. Numbers erase history, erase family, erase self. When you reduce a child to a digit, you can do anything to him. You can medicate, you can strap, you can experiment, you can bury, and no ledger will ever scream. The intake forms didn't write son, they didn't write brother. They wrote subject, they wrote deficient, they wrote unfit. Each word inked in bureaucratic neatness, each word a blade severing the last ties to home. And so the brothers disappeared, not in the sense of vanishing, but in the deeper, more terrifying sense. They were absorbed, consumed by a system that chewed through thousands of children and left only silence behind. This is where the nightmare begins. But I want you to understand, this is not just history. This is not just the tragedy of one family in 1963. What happened to the Fialkowski brothers is the blueprint. It is the pattern of how power has always worked. Seduction, consent manufactured through pressure, separation, reduction to data, and finally, disappearance. The asylum is just a symbol, a prototype of every larger system you live inside today. You are not supposed to know this. You are not supposed to connect the dots. But if you keep listening, I will show you how the walls of Penhurst still stand around you, not in brick and iron, but in structures invisible yet more binding. The Fialkowski brothers were sacrificed to a machine older than America, older than kings, and the closer we look, the more you will see that the same machine is still running, and it still feeds. So I ask you now, do you want to keep going? Do you want to walk deeper into the corridors of Penhurst with me? Because once we begin, the air will get colder, The doors will shut behind us. And what you learn cannot be unlearned. Do you know what makes a prison worse than bars? Paper. Paper that looks harmless. Paper that is stamped, filed, and signed by hands that never have to face the eyes of the people they condemn. That was how the Fialkowski brothers were stolen, not in the dead of night, not by force, but by forms. The story begins years earlier, when the family first arrived in America. They had already endured one apocalypse. Warsaw had been turned to ash by war. They had walked through ruins, stepped over rubble, and lived in silence, punctured by gunfire. When they boarded the ship bound for America in 1950, they thought they were stepping into salvation. The Statue of Liberty's torch looked like a promise. What they didn't realize is that promises made by nations are only bait, and the hook is always waiting. They were resettled in Pennsylvania, given a modest row house by a church sponsor. Jan, the father, broke his body in the steel mills. Anna, the mother, struggled to learn English in the parish basement, chalk letters smudged by her trembling hands. They were immigrants trying to plant roots in foreign soil. But the soil itself was poisoned with judgment. Neighbors whispered about their accents. Social workers appeared with clipboards. And the children, already fragile from hunger and the scars of war, struggled in school. Their silence, their slow speech, their Polish phrases, all of it was noted down in official ink. Do you see how it works? First, they isolate you with language, then they label you, then they offer help. That's the cycle, and every step feels like concern. Every word sounds like kindness, but underneath it is scaffolding built for one purpose, to remove you from your power. By the early 1960s, the visits from social workers had become routine. They spoke with the calm certainty of people who know the system will always back their voice over yours. They told Jan and Anna the boys were unsuited for typical education. They used terms like better prospects and professional management. They dressed their words in the clothing of compassion, but every phrase was a nail. The trap was closing. At night, Anna overheard other Polish mothers whispering in the parish hall, stories of cousins institutionalized in Allentown. Children sent away to Philadelphia, special homes, who never returned. Their voices were low, but their eyes carried fear. Still, when Jan sat at their kitchen table, pressing his rough hands flat on the wood, he whispered in Polish, "Temporary. Always temporary." He believed what the officials told him because believing was easier than admitting the nightmare might never end. This is how institutions devour, not with one bite, but with slow starvation of hope. Every letter from a caseworker made it harder to resist. Every debt piled onto Jan's shoulders made his voice weaker. Every cold winter in that row house made Anna's silence heavier. By March 1963, their resistance had turned brittle. The word temporary became their last candle against the dark, and that candle was already burning low. When the Plymouth turned toward Penhurst's gates, the family didn't realize they weren't bringing their children to doctors. They were delivering them to a factory of despair, a factory of data, a factory that would strip not just their sons' names, but the family's very memory of them. Because once Penhurst had you, the institution decided what parts of you could exist. Penhurst wasn't built for healing. Look at its architecture. It sprawled across Chester County like a fortress. Red brick walls stretched into wings like arms ready to hold, but those arms only tightened into iron grips. The windows were barred. The intake building loomed like a courthouse, and inside, every hallway was narrow, not to comfort but to funnel, to restrict, to control. Buildings don't lie. They reveal the true nature of power. Penhurst was not designed for children. It was designed for obedience. Do you know what the most dangerous phrase in any society is? For your own good. Those words are poison sugar. They taste like care, but they burn like acid. That was the phrase that carried the brothers across the threshold. That was the phrase that allowed officials to pry their hands apart. That was the phrase that sealed the doors behind them. And it is the same phrase used today in every system that takes from you while promising safety. The intake stripped them of everything familiar. their clothes confiscated, their toys discarded, their speech dismissed as language deficient. Even their fingerprints were pressed into ink, catalogued not as identities, but as specimens. And then came the renaming, numbers assigned in neat columns, patient 4847, patient 4848. Do you understand how sinister that is? Once you are a number, you no longer belong to yourself, you belong to the system, but the cruelty went deeper. The boys were not only reduced to numbers, they were divided, one sent toward 6, the other toward 12. Separation wasn't an accident, it was policy. Families divided are weaker, children alone are pliable. When you cannot lean on blood, you bend to authority. Penhurst knew this. They wrote it into the architecture, into the protocols, into the very air. From that day forward, the brothers would glimpse each other only through stolen seconds, a glance in a hallway, a whisper from a sympathetic attendant. And each time their eyes carried the same desperate question. Are you still alive? Think about that. Imagine being 8 years old, and the only question you have for your brother is whether his heart still beats inside those walls. That is what Penhurst turned love into, a calculation of survival. And here is the truth most people cannot face. Penhurst was not unique. It was not an aberration. It was a mirror, a reflection of the larger machinery of the state. The asylum was not separate from America. It was America, stripped of its polite mask. What Penhurst did to children in brick and mortar, other systems do every day in subtler ways. They separate you from your power. They erase your name. They reduce you to data. And then they make you disappear. That is why you were never supposed to hear this story. Because if you understand Penhurst, you begin to understand everything else. You begin to see the same structures in schools, in hospitals, in bureaucracies, in governments. The same architecture of obedience, the same corridors of silence, the same iron gates hiding behind friendly words. The Fialkowski brothers were just 2 children. But their suffering exposes the blueprint of a much larger cage, and once you see the blueprint, you cannot unsee it. We are only at the beginning. The descent has only just begun. The walls of Penhurst are closing in around us, and I'm going to take you deeper still, into the wards, into the experiments, into the silence where voices were buried. But before we walk further, ask yourself, how much truth can you take? How much of your old world are you willing to burn away? Because once we move forward, there is no return. The sound hit first, before the smell, before the sight. The sound of Penhurst's wards was its own language, a low, endless chorus of cries, moans, mutters, and the hollow clatter of metal on tile. To step into Ward 6 was to step into a soundscape of despair, where human voices were no longer voices but background noise, like wind through broken windows. This was where one of the brothers, the younger, was placed. He was 8 years old, but in Penhurst he was no longer a boy, he was an inmate, a term written in case notes, used casually by attendants. Imagine hearing that word at 8. Inmate. You aren't sick, you aren't lost, you are criminal. The cot assigned to him was narrow, pressed against a peeling wall, its mattress torn at the corners, stuffing yellowed like old teeth. Beside him lay a boy with twisted legs strapped into leather restraints. Across the row, another child rocked endlessly, his forehead marked by a raw groove from striking the same spot against iron bars. The ward was a gallery of broken bodies and silenced voices, not broken by birth, but broken by the institution itself. Every morning followed the same script. Wake up at 6 o'clock a.m., not by sunlight. The windows were caged and half-shuttered, but by the metallic screech of doors opening. Attendants in white coats, sometimes reeking of cigarettes and aftershave, barked commands. Children lined up in rows, bare feet slapping against cold tile. Breakfast was ladled into tin bowls. Oatmeal, watery, often cold before it reached them. If you ate too slowly, the bowl was taken. If you spilled, you were slapped. Hunger was constant, but fear was stronger. The older brother, in Ward 12, lived the same cycle, but there, the punishments were sharper. Ward 12 was reserved for unruly boys. What counted as unruly? Asking for your mother, crying at night, refusing to march fast enough. Even whispering in Polish to another patient was marked as disruptive. For this, the older brother was often strapped to his bed for hours, leather belts digging into his wrists until they bled. The attendants called it quiet time. The boys called it what it was, disappearance. Do you know the worst cruelty of Penhurst? It wasn't the blows, it wasn't the hunger, it was the erasure of identity. When the brothers spoke Polish, their last tether to home, to their parents, to Warsaw's ruins and their mother's lullabies, attendants barked, English only. Each slip into their native tongue was punished. Slowly, syllable by syllable, Penhurst starved the Polish out of them. Their names, too, were mangled. Long foreign consonants were shaved down into crude nicknames. Their family name was misspelled on files, then repeated so often it became fact. By the end of their first year, even they hesitated when trying to remember the true shape of their surname. Language is identity. Strip it away, and you strip memory itself. That was Penhurst's invisible violence, to make children forget they had ever belonged anywhere else. The brothers saw each other rarely, maybe once a week, maybe less, in hallways when wards were rotated for bathing. They were not allowed to speak freely, but they stole glances, eyes locked for seconds, carrying everything words could not. Sometimes, in those rare moments, the older would brush his hand against the youngers as they passed. It was a secret code. I am here. You are not alone. But guards were quick. If they lingered, the hands were slapped apart. The institution thrived on separation, divide and rule. That was the unspoken law. Children with siblings were placed in different wards. Friends were rotated every few months. Any attempt to form bonds was broken, because bonds meant resistance. Bonds meant memory, and memory was dangerous. Punishments were not just physical, they were psychological experiments in obedience. In Ward 12, attendants forced boys to stand facing a wall for hours. If they moved, they were beaten with a paddle. In Ward 6, the younger brother witnessed a child locked in a dark closet for days. When the door opened, the boy could no longer speak, only rock in silence. That silence spread like contagion. Other children, watching, learned quickly. Silence was safer than speech. Do you see the method? This was not care. This was conditioning. It was not about healing broken children. It was about breaking whole children into silence. At night, the sounds returned. Moans, sobs, the muttered prayers of children whispering to saints they barely remembered. Sometimes in the small hours, attendants ignored the cries. Other times they punished them. Sleep became a negotiation with fear. You did not know if your dream would end with dawn or with a slap. And above all, there was the smell. It clung to everything, a mixture of bleach, urine, mildew, and sweat. It sank into the mattresses, into the cots, into the very walls. Even when the brothers managed brief moments of comfort, a shared glance, a stolen smile, the smell was there, reminding them, you are not home. You are not free. You are property of Penhurst. Meanwhile, outside those walls, their parents were reassured. Letters from the institution spoke of progress. Reports described the boys as adjusting. Jan and Anna clung to those words. They believed. They needed to. Because the alternative, that their sons were trapped in a waking nightmare, was too unbearable to face. That is how the machinery of erasure works. It is not only the children who are broken, it is the parents too. It is the entire family. Line choked at the root. Penhurst did not just lock away bodies, it locked away history. But here's the darkest truth. Penhurst wasn't unique. Across America, institutions just like it were operating. Willowbrook in New York, Byberry in Philadelphia, Fernald in Massachusetts. Thousands of children, stripped, numbered, silenced. Each one convinced that their story would never be told. Each one erased not only from society, but from memory. And yet, here we are, speaking their names again, dragging their stories back into the light. Do you feel that unease, that resistance in your chest? That's the system fighting back even now. because every retelling is an act of rebellion against erasure. The brothers could not resist then, but we can resist now, by refusing to forget. And still, we are only on the threshold. What happened in the wards was only daily life. The deeper horrors were yet to come. Experiments, neglect, deaths covered up in files stamped confidential. The kind of truths that institutions bury so deep, they hope you never dare to dig them up. The question is, do you dare? There is a phrase that echoes across Penhurst's archived reports for research purposes. Cold, bureaucratic, harmless on the surface, but inside those words lies one of the darkest truths, that the children were not just patients, they were subjects. The Fialkowski brothers, like thousands of others, entered Penhurst during an era obsessed with turning people into data. Doctors, administrators, psychologists, they called it science. But the wards were not laboratories of healing, they were laboratories of control, and the experiments weren't conducted in sterile rooms with white gloves. They were carried out in corridors that stank of mildew, by attendants with belts on their hips, and by researchers who rarely looked children in the eye. The younger brother was pulled into it first. Ward 6 had been chosen for a language study. Researchers wanted to measure delayed speech patterns in immigrant children. But the experiment was never about helping him speak, it was about stripping his mother tongue. For weeks, attendants forced him to repeat English words, punishing him when Polish slipped out. His failures were documented as evidence of deficiency. The files called it progress. In reality, it was erasure written into science. The older brother's body was used differently. Ward 12 was considered ideal for testing behavioral interventions. Straps, paddles, isolation rooms. Each was recorded in neat columns, as though suffering could be graphed. Attendants were ordered to record how long a boy screamed before going silent in restraints. Silence was noted as success. Do you see how upside down this was? Silence was not healing. Silence was breaking. And yet in Penhurst's reports, silence glowed like achievement. But these were only the surface experiments. Beneath them lurked practices too grim to parade openly. In the archives, whispers remain of children injected with experimental sedatives, drugs so strong that A left some patients unable to stand for days. There were tests with electric shocks, delivered not to save lives, but to measure compliance. A jolt for disobedience, a jolt for speaking out, a jolt for failing to line up quickly enough. The records call it conditioning. Survivors called it terror. One former attendant, years later, confessed that children were sometimes fed strange concoctions, new formulas of vitamins, proteins, even hormones, without explanation. Their reactions were noted down like notes on livestock. This wasn't care, this was human husbandry. And what of the children who did not survive? Their files were sealed, their names quietly erased. Death was not uncommon in Penhurst. Malnutrition, untreated infections, pneumonia from cold dormitories. When a child died, the paperwork was swift. The phrase used most often, failure to thrive. A phrase that places the blame not on the system, but on the child's own body, as if it were their fault for not surviving the cruelty designed around them. The brothers learned quickly that survival meant obedience. The younger one, desperate to avoid the punishment of language drills, began refusing to speak at all. Silence became his shield. The older, in Ward 12, learned to stand perfectly still, eyes down, hands clasped, whenever attendants approached. He became invisible, a shadow boy. Invisibility was safer than defiance. But invisibility comes at a cost. Slowly you begin to believe you are nothing more than a shadow. What's most disturbing is how Penhurst presented these horrors to the outside world. Brochures described it as a progressive institution. Reports to parents spoke of modern treatments and cutting-edge research. Administrators proudly gave tours to state officials, carefully steering them away from the worst wards. They showed tidy classrooms with a handful of children neatly dressed, rehearsed like actors. Behind locked doors, the real Penhurst festered. And yet, the system worked because most people wanted to believe. Parents, desperate to trust, accepted the reports. Politicians, eager to save money, funded the institution because it promised to be cheaper than real care. And the public, ordinary citizens, preferred not to ask questions. After all, Penhurst was hidden on a hill, out of sight. If you don't see suffering, you don't have to feel responsible for it. But the children saw everything. They saw the electric shocks. They saw the boys locked in closets. They saw the girls, yes, girls too, led away by attendants and returning hours later with empty eyes, never speaking of what had been done. The walls remembered it all, even if the files tried to hide it. Here is the truth no official report will tell you. Penhurst was not an accident. It was not a mistake. It was designed to be exactly what it was. A warehouse of bodies, a feeding ground for experiments, a place where unwanted children could be made invisible. Institutions like Penhurst were the shadow side of progress. As America marched into the space age, building rockets and dreaming of the stars, it was also building cages for the children it didn't want to see. And yet, amid the horror, the brothers clung to the thinnest threads of resistance. Sometimes, late at night, they carved marks into the wood of their cots, lines scratched with fingernails, hidden from attendants. They were counting days, measuring survival, refusing in secret to disappear completely. Those scratches are gone now. The cots were dismantled when Penhurst was shut down, but imagine them. 2 children alone in different wards, carving tiny lines no one would ever notice. That is what survival looked like in Penhurst. Not heroism, not escape, just the refusal to vanish without leaving some trace. But survival had a price. When the boys were finally reunited years later, their eyes carried the weight of experiments, punishments, and silences too heavy to ever put into words. Their childhood had been stolen, repurposed, dissected, and what lingered was not just trauma. It was the realization that they had been used as data, as test subjects, as raw material for a system that called itself progress. And here is where the unease sharpens into terror. Penhurst's records are not unique. Similar files exist in every state, documenting experiments on the institutionalized, the poor, the voiceless. This story is not only about the Fialkowski brothers, it is about a pattern that stretches across decades, a pattern that feeds on silence and trust. The question is, how much of it still continues, hidden under different names, in places we are told are for care, for treatment, for protection? Or because if Penhurst teaches us anything, it is this. Once a society learns it can erase people under the banner of compassion, it never truly stops. It only changes the words. And we have only begun to peel back the mask. Every empire of silence eventually leaks. No matter how thick the walls, no matter how many locked doors, sound finds its way out. For Penhurst, the cracks began as whispers, fragments carried by ex-attendants, rumors muttered by local townspeople, suspicions raised by parents who noticed bruises, weight loss, or missing letters. At first, the system smothered these whispers with paperwork, but whispers, when they pile up, become thunder. The 1960s were a dangerous decade for institutions. Across America, the sheen of authority was beginning to tarnish. Civil rights protests challenged segregation. Anti-war voices questioned the government's power to send young men to die. And in hidden corners, journalists began asking dangerous questions about what was happening behind closed doors. Penhurst, with its sprawling campus and its swelling population of children and adults, was impossible to ignore forever. The first real breach came not from parents or officials, but from workers inside. Attendants who could no longer stomach the cruelty. Nurses who saw too many children die. One former staff member described Penhurst as a snake pit, a human warehouse. That phrase would later echo through courtrooms and newspapers, but at the time it was dismissed as exaggeration. After all, who would believe a low-paid attendant over the polished reports of administrators? Still, the stories multiplied. Children strapped naked to benches, overcrowded dormitories with 40 beds crammed into a single room. Patients left to sit for hours in soiled clothing. The whispers became harder to ignore. Some reached parents, some reached priests, a few even reached saintly 8 officials. But each time, Penhurst's administrators countered with their favorite weapon, language. Words like necessary restraint, therapeutic isolation, budgetary challenges. Bureaucracy was a shield, and for years it worked, but truth has a way of seeping out through the cracks. By the late 1960s, reporters began showing up at Penhurst's gates. They were told the same story, that Penhurst was underfunded but essential, challenged but improving. Administrators staged carefully curated tours, tidy classrooms, smiling children rehearsed to perform basic greetings, a playground swept clean just for the cameras. Behind the staged scenes, wards festered. The cruelty continued, but the public, seeing only the show, turned away again. Then came the photographs. In 1968, a Philadelphia journalist gained access to the wards with a camera. What he captured could not be explained away by budget cuts or bureaucratic euphemisms. Emaciated children lying on bare mattresses, rows of patients tied to benches, a girl sitting in her own waste, eyes empty. These were not the images of care. They were images of neglect so brutal it tore through the screen and into the conscience of anyone who saw them. When the report aired on television, it sent shockwaves. Viewers sat in their living rooms, staring in disbelief. This wasn't a distant country. This wasn't a nightmare from history. This was Pennsylvania. This was happening now. And it wasn't just Penhurst. Similar institutions across the nation began to feel the spotlight's glare. For the Fialkowski brothers, the attention came too late to undo the years already stolen. But by then they were teenagers inside walls that had become part of their very bones. They heard rumors of outsiders coming, cameras flashing. But inside the wards, little changed at first. Administrators doubled down. Attendants tightened discipline. The institution braced against exposure. The parents, Jan and Anna, were torn open by the reports. For years they had clung to Penhurst's official letters. Progress reports, reassurances, promises of treatment. They had convinced themselves that the silence of their sons was temporary, that one day the boys would come home healthier, stronger, ready for life. But when the news showed children with hollow eyes and wasted bodies, Anna recognized her sons in every face. She collapsed in tears. Jan, hardened by years in the steel mills, clenched his fists until his knuckles split. They had trusted the system, and the system had devoured their children. But exposure is not the same as justice. Even after the photographs, Penhurst did not close overnight. Institutions are slow beasts. They survive on inertia, on bureaucracy, on the reluctance of those in power to admit guilt. Administrators argued, politicians delayed, panels were formed, reports were filed. Meanwhile, the children remained inside. The real turning point came in the 1970s, when parents and advocates joined forces with lawyers. They filed lawsuits demanding Penhurst be held accountable for violating the constitutional rights of its residents. The case, Haldeman versus Penhurst State School and Hospital, would become a landmark. For the first time, a federal court was forced to ask a dangerous question. Does warehousing people in neglect and abuse violate the promise of liberty and dignity under the Constitution? The answer should have been obvious, but it took years of testimony, years of evidence, years of survivors, recounting horrors no child should ever endure. Former staff described beatings, neglect, death. Parents wept on the stand, admitting how they had been deceived, and through it all the state tried to defend Penhurst, not by denying the cruelty, but by arguing that it was necessary, that there was no alternative. That was Penhurst's final weapon, inevitability. The claim that such institutions, however flawed, were the only option, that without them, children like the Fialkowski brothers would have nowhere to go. It was a lie built on fear, fear of difference, fear of responsibility, fear of seeing what society had chosen to hide. But the lie cracked. In 1977, Judge Raymond Broderick issued a decision that reverberated far beyond Chester County. Penhurst's conditions violated the constitutional rights of its residents. The ruling demanded reform. The institution would not survive much longer. For the brothers, the ruling was both a release and a wound. By then, they had grown into young men shaped by Penhurst's walls. Their bodies carried scars from restraints. Their minds carried silence from years of suppression. Freedom, when it came, was not a door flung open, but a slow, stumbling step into a world they no longer recognized. And for us, the story of Penhurst is not just a history lesson, it is a mirror because Penhurst was never just about one institution. It was about what happens when a society decides some lives are less worthy, less human, less visible. It was about how easily compassion becomes a mask for control. Even now, decades later, when the buildings crumble and the weeds reclaim the campus, the echoes remain. Tourists call it haunted. Paranormal investigators bring cameras. They say they hear voices in the halls. Maybe they do. But the real haunting is not the whispers of ghosts. It is the silence of memory. The lives erased, the names lost, the brothers who never truly came home. And yet, we have only traced the outline. The full truth is darker still, buried in sealed files, in memories too painful to speak aloud. The deeper question remains: why did so many look away for so long? The answer will take us further into the shadows. The gates of Penhurst did not slam shut in a single moment of triumph. They creaked, they dragged, they resisted. Even after Judge Broderick's ruling in 1977, the institution limped on. Appeals clogged the courts. State officials argued over funding. Administrators insisted they needed time to transition residents. And so the children, now teenagers, now adults, remained inside the very place a federal court had declared unconstitutional. It took nearly a decade before Penhurst truly closed its doors. Nearly a decade more of hollow routines, of whispered promises of freedom, of rumors passed between cots. Imagine that, to be told you were no longer supposed to be imprisoned, and yet still wake every morning to the same barred windows, the same metallic clang of doors, the same sour stench of bleach and neglect. Hope, dangled too long, becomes another form of torment. For the Fialkowski brothers, freedom came not as a moment of celebration, but as a disorienting unraveling. When Penhurst finally shuttered in 1987, they were transferred out, not to their family home, which had grown too old and too poor to take them back, but to group homes scattered across Pennsylvania. The outside world was not the America they had once glimpsed through the row house windows of their childhood. It was a strange, hostile landscape. Consider what it meant to walk out after decades inside. Traffic lights flashing colors you barely understood. Cars roaring past with a speed that felt violent. Supermarkets with endless aisles of food, overwhelming in abundance after years of watery oatmeal and crusts of bread. People walking with headphones, newspapers, conversations about politics and baseball. A language of life the brothers no longer spoke. One of them, the younger, would not speak at all. Penhurst had drilled silence so deeply into him that words felt dangerous, forbidden. He communicated with gestures, glances, the faintest of sounds. Therapists called it selective mutism. But it was not a disorder. It was survival, carved into his bones by years of punishment. The older tried harder. He attempted jobs, custodial work, dishwashing, odd tasks through local programs. But each time he was undone by panic. The world outside Penhurst had no rules he could trust. Inside, obedience meant survival. Outside, obedience meant nothing. He lived in a permanent state of confusion, as if every sidewalk and street corner were a trap. Their parents, Jan and Anna, by then were frail. They had aged decades in the silence of their son's absence. When they reunited, it was not the joyous embrace of family restored, but it was awkward, broken, filled with long pauses. The boys they remembered were gone. The men who returned were shadows, bearing the weight of years stolen. Anna wept. Jan stared out the window, jaw tight, as if searching for someone to blame. But there was no single face to hold accountable. The machine had been faceless all along. And here is the cruelest truth. Penhurst did not end when its gates closed. The walls remained. The campus, sprawling and decayed, stood as a rotting reminder. Windows shattered, roofs sagged, vines crawled through the cracks. The smell of mildew seeped from the buildings like breath from a corpse. Locals whispered about ghosts. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside at night. Paranormal investigators brought cameras chasing shadows in the halls, but the real haunting was not the flicker of lights or the echo of footsteps. The real haunting was memory. Every peeling wall held the imprint of children strapped to benches. Every rusting bed frame carried the weight of bodies left hungry, lonely, silenced. The haunting was historical, not supernatural. And yet, America, true to its nature, transformed Penhurst into spectacle. Haunted house attractions were staged in its ruins. Tourists paid to walk the same corridors where children once wept. The suffering of the past was commodified, sold as entertainment. Do you see the grotesque symmetry? The same institution that once profited from caging children now profits from the thrill of their absence. Meanwhile, survivors like the Fialkowski brothers faded into obscurity. Some lived in group homes, some drifted into homelessness, some disappeared into prisons, new cages to replace the old. The state promised community integration, but funding was thin, oversight was weaker, and society's indifference was bottomless. For many, Penhurst was not the end of their captivity, only the beginning of a new kind of exile. And yet, even in exile, resistance flickered. Survivors testified before commissions. Some spoke to journalists, haltingly, in fragments. One said, "They told me I was nothing. I still hear that voice when I try to sleep." Another whispered, "We were buried alive." These testimonies became the fuel for a broader movement, the disability rights movement, which rose in the 1980s and 1990s to demand not just freedom from institutions, but dignity, autonomy, respect. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 was one outcome of this struggle. It promised accessibility, equal rights, the tearing down of barriers. But even that landmark law was written in blood and silence, paid for by the lives of children erased in places like Penhurst. The Fialkowski brothers never became activists. They did not march or give speeches. Their resistance was quieter, more tragic. They lived, they survived, they carried scars through every day, every interaction, every restless night. And in that survival, they bore witness, even if they never spoke. Their very existence testified to what Penhurst had done and what America had allowed. So when you hear ghost stories about Penhurst, when someone tells you they heard a scream in the hallway or saw a shadow in the infirmary, remember this: the real ghosts are not restless spirits. The real ghosts are living survivors, walking among us, carrying memories too heavy for their shoulders. And here's the hardest part. Penhurst is not just history. It is a blueprint. The machinery of control, the erasure of identity, the bureaucratic mask of compassion. These did not die with the institution. They live on in other forms: detention centers, psychiatric hospitals, prisons, group homes, different names, same design. The ruins of Penhurst stand as a warning, but a warning unheeded becomes prophecy. The brothers' story forces us to ask, have we truly dismantled the cage or merely repainted it? We are not finished, because the most disturbing revelations are not about what Penhurst did in the past, but about what still echoes in the present. Penhurst closed in 1987. The gates rusted, the walls sagged, the roofs caved in. Politicians declared victory. Never again will such an institution shame our state. Newspapers hailed the closure as progress. America congratulated itself on its conscience. But here's the lie. Penhurst never ended. It multiplied. It changed its mask. The architecture of confinement, the logic of segregation, the language of safety and care, all of it lived on, quietly migrating into other corners of American life. Look around. You will see Penhurst in the sprawling networks of for-profit prisons where inmates are reduced to labor contracts. You will see Penhurst in psychiatric hospitals where restraint and sedation replace therapy. You will see Penhurst in immigration detention centers where children are locked in cages under fluorescent lights, stripped of language, stripped of touch. You will see Penhurst in nursing homes where elders are warehoused until their voices fade to nothing. Different uniforms, different walls, same silence. The philosophy remains identical. Take those society has deemed inconvenient, the poor, the disabled, the immigrant, the deviant, the elderly, and move them out of sight. Lock them away under the banner of protection. Seal them behind walls so we can pretend the problem has been solved. This is what the disability rights activists meant when they said Penhurst was not just a place but a system. They saw that Penhurst was not an aberration. It was a blueprint, a template of how power treats vulnerability. The Fialkowski brothers knew this truth in their bones, even if they never named it. After Penhurst, they lived in group homes. The names of the program sounded softer, more humane. Community living, supportive housing. But inside, the rules were rigid, the days predictable, the staff often indifferent. Their world was still measured in schedules and surveillance. Dinner at 6, medication at 8, lights out at 10, freedom, in theory, confinement, in practice. One of the brothers once tried to leave his group home to visit a nearby diner. He had money in his pocket, a rare allowance. But when he stepped out the door, staff stopped him. They told him it was unsafe, that he might get lost, that the world outside was dangerous. He returned to his room, staring out the window at the neon glow of the diner's sign, so close, yet impossibly far. Doesn't that sound familiar? The same paternalistic language used decades earlier. We only want to protect them. We only want to keep them safe. But protection without freedom is just another name for captivity. And here's where the story sharpens into something more unsettling. Penhurst was exposed because a few courageous families, like the Fialkowskis, shouted into the void until the void cracked open. But today, there are thousands of smaller Penhursts scattered across the country, not as massive fortresses, but as networks, programs and facilities hidden in plain sight. They thrive precisely because they do not look like Penhurst. They wear the mask of compassion. They call themselves homes. They say the words community. But ask the people inside, and you may hear the same old refrain. I feel invisible. Let's return to the brothers. As the years went on, the younger one, the silent one, began to show signs of rebellion, not through words, he never spoke again, but through small acts of defiance. He refused meals, he stayed awake all night, he stared at staff with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. It was his way of asserting that something inside him still resisted. The older brother's rebellion was quieter still. He collected scraps of paper, scribbled drawings of stairwells, windows, keys. He seemed obsessed with the imagery of escape, even when no one was holding him captive anymore. His caretakers dismissed it as obsession, but perhaps it was a map of the mind, a way to process the years of being locked inside. They lived, but never fully belonged. They were free, but never fully free. Penhurst had left its imprint too deep. This is the truth society avoids. Institutions do not only shape the years people spend inside them, they shape the decades after. They rewire thought, memory, trust, even the body itself. They linger in posture, in speech, in silence. A survivor of Penhurst is never simply released. They may carry the institution with them forever, as if the walls had been rebuilt inside their ribs. And yet, here is where the story takes its most haunting turn. For the rest of us, Penhurst functions like a mirror. It shows us who we become when we stop seeing people as people. It shows us how easily language, words like protection, safety, care, can be twisted into chains. It shows us how bureaucracy can erase humanity without a single act of overt cruelty, simply by hiding it behind forms, signatures, and locked doors. The ruins of Penhurst stand today as both a spectacle and a warning. Tourists still wander through its corridors. Paranormal shows still broadcast shadows and whispers. But the real haunting is not supernatural. It is structural. It is systemic. The haunting is this. Every time we walk past a prison and do not question why it is full, every time we ignore a group home resident sitting alone on a bench, every time we tell ourselves that those people are being taken care of and therefore need nothing more from us. That is Penhurst, alive and well. The brothers' story compels us to ask, if we had lived then, would we have spoken out? Would we have joined Jan and Anna in their impossible fight? Or would we have turned away, comforted by the belief that the state knew best? And here's the final twist. The question is not about then, it is about now, because right now, as you hear this story, there are institutions, modern Penhursts, filled with people whose voices are silenced, whose families are dismissed, whose pain is hidden. The true legacy of Penhurst is not just a chapter of history, it is a test that America keeps failing, and the brothers, though they never sought it, are the proof. They lived through the machinery of erasure. They survived it, though they never escaped its shadow. and in their survival, they stand as living indictments. It's walking reminders of what happens when a society decides that certain lives are better forgotten. The ruins are crumbling, but the system is not. The story isn't over. The closure of Penhurst was supposed to be the end. Judges wrote it, politicians announced it, newspapers printed it, and yet for the people who lived behind its walls, Penhurst never really ended. It lived on in their sleep, in their habits, in the ways their bodies moved through the world. The Fialkowski brothers carried it most visibly. The younger one never spoke again, his silence an eternal echo of the punishments that had once followed every sound. He did not trust words. He did not trust that language could be safe. Instead, he carved out a small vocabulary of gestures, a hand pressed to his chest to mean fear, a finger pointing upward to mean hope, a slow shake of the head to mean no. His caretakers struggled to understand him, but anyone who paid attention could see he was still fighting to be heard. The older brother had words, but they came fractured, tentative, wrapped in hesitation. He stuttered. He paused. He apologized constantly, as though speaking itself was a crime. His notebooks, filled with sketches of locks, staircases and keys, became his truest form of expression. They were not just drawings. They were memory maps, symbols of both entrapment and yearning. His caregivers dismissed them as fixations. But the truth was obvious. He was still trying to escape. These were not just personal scars, they were political ones. They revealed how Penhurst's violence extended beyond its walls, shaping lives for decades after release. And when survivors across the country, not just from Penhurst, but from institutions like Willowbrook in New York or Fernald in Massachusetts, began to speak out, a pattern emerged. Their voices, broken though they were, formed a collective testimony. They said, "We were treated like animals." They said, "We were punished for being alive." They said, "We were buried alive in plain sight." Oh, out of that chorus rose the modern disability rights movement. Activists, many of them former residents of institutions, began demanding not just closure of places like Penhurst, but dignity, autonomy, and inclusion. They fought for education in public schools, for ramps on sidewalks, for communication aids, for personal choice in where and how to live. By the late 1980s, their fight reached Washington, and in 1990, after years of organizing, sit-ins, and testimonies, Congress passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. It was a landmark, outlawing discrimination, mandating accessibility, recognizing disabled people as full citizens. But here is the hidden truth. The ADA was written in the ink of survivors' pain. The law did not fall from the sky. It was carved from the silence of people like the Fialkowskis, whose lives had been crushed and whose families had been dismissed until they shouted so loud the nation could not look away. And yet, even the ADA could not erase the blueprint of Penhurst, because while ramps were built and schools opened their doors, other cages were rising. Take the immigration detention centers along America's borders. Inside them, children lie on mats beneath foil blankets. They are told it is for their safety. They are told their families are being processed. They are told to wait. The language is bureaucratic, compassionate on the surface. But look closer. Rows of children under guard, stripped of touch, stripped of freedom. It is Penhurst in new clothes. Or look at for-profit prisons, where companies earn revenue from every inmate they house. The bodies of the incarcerated become units of profit, just as the bodies at Penhurst were once managed for the sake of efficiency. In both cases, those inside are reduced to numbers, population counts, budget lines, head counts. Or look at nursing homes where the elderly are warehoused, sedated, left alone in dark rooms for hours because the staff is underpaid and the system is underfunded. Again, the language is soothing. Assisted living, long-term care. But the reality is neglect hidden in plain sight. Do you see the pattern? The same logic Penhurst perfected. Remove the inconvenient, place them out of sight, label it care. Repeats itself endlessly. This is why survivors' voices matter, not only because they bear witness to what happened, but because they warn us of what continues to happen. Their stories are not relics of the past, they are warnings about the present. The Fialkowski brothers never became activists. They were too wounded, too quiet, too broken by what was taken from them. But others carried their story forward. Journalists documented it, advocates cited it in lawsuits, teachers used it as a case study in ethics classes. Their silence became a kind of testimony in itself, a reminder of the cost of looking away. And here's the haunting part. The scars Pennhurst left were not only on those inside, they were on us, on the neighbors who saw the buses come and go but never asked where they went, on the taxpayers who signed the checks but never asked what was happening behind the walls, on the politicians who spoke of care while turning a blind eye to cruelty. Every institution like Pennhurst exists not only because of those who run it, but because of those who allow it. And that is the mirror this story forces us to face. Where are the Pennhursts of today, and why do we allow them? The brothers remind us that the cost of silence is staggering. Their lives, fragmented, constrained, haunted, are monuments to what happens when a society decides certain people are disposable. And their story asks us the hardest question of all. Will we recognize the blueprint of Pennhurst when we see it again, or will we pretend, once more, that the walls are built for safety? Pennhurst is not gone. It is only waiting for us to see it. Walk through the ruins of Pennhurst today, and you will find a grotesque contradiction. The buildings still stand, shattered windows, collapsed roofs, vines twisting through stairwells. The walls are marked with graffiti, teenagers' initials, fragments of poetry left by trespassers. If you listen closely, the wind hissing through broken panes sounds like whispers. For decades, locals avoided the place. It was too eerie, too heavy with memory. But America has a way of turning tragedy into spectacle. Soon, paranormal investigators set up cameras. Television crews arrived with infrared lights asking, "Did you hear that?" Tourists began buying tickets for Halloween haunted attractions, staged in the same corridors where children once lived and died unseen. People paid to be frightened, to chase shadows, to hear fabricated ghost stories. But the truth is, you don't need ghosts to haunt Pennhurst. The haunting is real, and it is historical. Every room, every bed frame, every bolt on the wall carries the imprint of suffering. The screams are not supernatural, they are remembered. This is where the story sharpens like a knife, because Pennhurst is not simply a ruin, not simply a horror show, not simply a cautionary tale. It is a mirror held up to us. And when we look into that mirror, what do we see? We see how easy it is to believe bureaucratic lies, that confinement is protection, that silence is safety, that erasure is mercy. We see how quickly society turns away from those it deems inconvenient. We see how fragile justice really is, how it takes decades of lawsuits, protests, and broken families just to undo a single institution. And we see how the blueprint lives on. Walk past a detention center, walk past a prison, walk past a nursing home where no one visits. Look into the faces behind the glass, the bars, the curtains. There is Pennhurst, still alive, still waiting. The Fialkowski brothers are older now, fragile. Their story is mostly forgotten. They did not become symbols. They did not become activists. They simply endured. And in their endurance lies the most haunting truth of all. Survival itself can be an act of resistance. When you hear ghost stories about Pennhurst, remember this. The real ghosts are living survivors, walking among us, carrying memories that the rest of the world would rather forget. And here is the secret America never wants to face. Pennhurst was not an accident. It was not a mistake. It was the logical conclusion of a society that values efficiency over humanity, silence over truth, and disappearance over dignity. Which means it can happen again. Which means, in many ways, it already has. So ask yourself, when you hear the word institution, what do you imagine? Do you picture walls and gates and locks? Or do you picture words like safety, treatment, care? Because that is where Pennhurst hides now. Not in crumbling ruins, not in paranormal legends, but in language, in policies, in systems that insist they exist to help, while quietly erasing those they claim to protect. The story of Pennhurst is not about the past. It is about the present. It is about us. And the question it leaves behind is simple, but unbearable. When the next Pennhurst rises, and it will we see it for what it is, or will we turn away again? The brothers' lives, scarred and silent, are the answer we cannot ignore. They remind us that history never stays buried. It breathes, it waits, it haunts, not with ghosts, not with shadows, but with truth. And truth is the scariest haunting of all.